What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Today I want to talk to you about Jack Kirby's The Demon. This is a comic book from the 1970s from DC Comics, written and drawn by Jack Kirby and inked and lettered by Mike Royer. This lasted 16 issues, and the story behind this series is that Jack Kirby had a contract that he had to do so many issues with DC in a month, and they wanted him to try and create some new books that he could write and draw the first issue, and then someone else could come in and pick it up after he left. And so he created the idea and the concept of the Demon over a lunch break with his family, and then after he did the first issue, his higher-ups said, hey, we love this so much so that we want you to stay on this book. And then they ended up canceling one of the Fourth World books that he was much more passionate about. And Mark Evanier, who was his protege sort of at the time, he goes into detail about that a little bit in a foreword in this book. And I did not know what to expect with this book, and this wasn't really what I expected, but at the end of the book, I did enjoy this. I am mostly familiar with Etrigan the Demon through his guest appearances in other books. He appeared in Kevin Smith's Green Arrow in the 90s. He appeared in some of the early Vertigo stuff, Neil Gaiman's Sandman and Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. He appeared in the Justice League cartoon. Much later in my life, I saw his appearance in the New Batman Adventures. I didn't see that when I was a kid, but I was familiar with the Demon as a fixture of the DC Universe, but not as the feature of his own series. I had read just a very little bit years and years ago. Whenever I would go back issue hunting at a comic book shop that no longer exists, I would find issues from like the Garth Ennis run in the 90s, and so I remember reading one or two of those. I read the Matt Wagner miniseries a few years ago. I don't remember much about that. So this was pretty much a new experience for me, getting into the Demon as the lead in his own series. And what was so different about this is that most of the time, Jason Blood is portrayed as a very shady character that you cannot trust. And then he turns into the Demon, who is fighting the forces of evil, but he is still a demon. And he is also an entity that you cannot trust. That's almost always how these two are portrayed. Jason Blood tried to kill Oliver Queen in Kevin Smith's Green Arrow run, because, long story short, Oliver didn't have a soul, and Jason Blood figured he would be dangerous that way. So the human entity of this dichotomy here tried to kill Oliver Queen. In Alan Moore's Swamp Thing run, Jason Blood shows up pretty early on. He is very creepy in that run, and he's not a bad guy, but he's also not someone that you want to spend any time with. And then in the Justice League cartoon, which has an origin story for Jason Blood and Etrigan that's actually very different than what this book does, and I like both versions, so it was very weird to me whenever I got into this book, and at the very beginning, the origin story is not what I was expecting from the Justice League cartoon. That was actually, I saw that episode of Justice League many years ago when I was probably in middle school, and so I was familiar with that origin of Etrigan, which is different than the origin given here. I like both origins. It's really hard for me to say which one I like better. But anyway, in the Justice League cartoon, the Justice League, they're not even sure if they can trust Etrigan. He's very shady and a little bit off color, I guess. They don't really like him. And so getting into this, the thing that threw me off the most is that Jason Blood is kind of a likable guy. He's not this weird, creepy dude who has this dark aura about him and everyone just doesn't trust him. That's not really the character that Jack Kirby is creating here. He's a pretty normal guy. In fact, when the series first begins, he doesn't even know that he is the host of a demon. He doesn't even know that he is immortal. The origin in the Justice League cartoon is that Jason Blood was a knight of Camelot, and he betrayed Camelot to Morgan Le Fay, and so Merlin saves his life and makes him immortal by binding him to a demon from the pits of hell. And then he has to continue fighting Morgan Le Fay and the various forces of darkness, and he uses the demon to do that. Here, Merlin, at the fall of Camelot, he summons a demon from the pits of hell, and then once the battle is done, he creates a mortal identity for the demon. So before that, Jason Blood did not exist. And then throughout the centuries, Jason Blood, I guess, periodically would lose his memories and then live a new life, because in the present day, there are all of these portraits of Jason Blood through the ages, and when someone would ask him about it, he genuinely believes that these are his ancestors. So it's a very different kind of thing than what the Justice League cartoon did. I like both ideas, though. I like both origins a lot. It's, like I said, really difficult for me to choose one. But anyway, this version of Jason Blood is not the unsavory guy who is going to laugh whenever he tells you how you're going to die, like he was in the Swamp Thing run. This is not the guy who's going to kill someone because their soul is currently not in their body. So this idea of Jason Blood being slowly corrupted by a demon from hell over the centuries, and then his good humanness is slowly influencing the demon to do the right thing, that's a very fascinating dichotomy, but it is not present in this book. This book is more just Jack Kirby's take on the weird supernatural stuff that was in vogue in the 1970s. You had things like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist, stuff from the 1970s that was quite a bit darker than this. This is doing it through the lens of an adventure comic, because Jack Kirby's character here is still fighting the forces of evil, and those horror movies, they're more about evil, and you might have someone combating the forces of evil, but it's not a given that that character, maybe a priest doing an exorcism or whatever, is actually going to win. Whereas this comic is still a little bit less dark. Mark Evanier says that it's because Jack Kirby was doing it from the perspective of somebody who saw death differently than other people. You had other horror comics at the time, like House of Mystery and House of Secrets, and he said those were about the inevitability of death, whereas this comic was about fighting against death and pushing against it. It went at it from a different angle. And so I really like the drawings here. Across the board, Jack Kirby is always a fantastic artist. I don't think, even in his later years of his career, I don't think that he ever failed as an artist. I have always loved his artwork. It's very bombastic, very exciting, very energetic. His work does not ever take time to slow down, and in this case, I think that's a good thing. Sometimes you might want a piece of media, a movie or a book or whatever, to slow down a little bit so that your characters can take a breather, and then you can kind of figure out what's going on. Jack Kirby doesn't do that, and I'm totally okay with that here. I love that his books are always just a mile a minute. It will throw out some idea, and then it will go on to a new idea before it has a chance to really explore that, and I like that quite a bit with his work. The writing here, I have said this before, I think Jack Kirby is a really good idea man. He will come up with very interesting ideas for characters. The idea of Jason Blood being a human who is bound to the demon, and he doesn't want to be bound to the demon, but he has to be to deal with all these supernatural threats. That's a very fascinating idea for a character. But in execution, I think Jack Kirby would have been better off if he had somebody here to kind of workshop the scripts a little bit, maybe say, okay, this idea for the story to take this direction doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I think Jack Kirby worked better when he had someone to kind of help him out with the story ideas. Him coming up with the character ideas and the broad scope of the series, that was all great, but I feel like he would have been better if he had someone else to kind of collaborate with him here. And I've said that before. I don't remember if I've ever talked about his OMAC, which was coming out around the same time. I had the same feeling on OMAC. I felt like it looked really cool. I liked a lot of the really crazy, energetic ideas, but it needed a better writer to kind of hammer it out a little bit. Feel the same way here. But I still like this quite a bit, and if you are a fan of Etrigan the Demon and you haven't looked at a lot of his solo stuff, I would recommend that you check this out. It's very interesting, historically speaking, if anything else, because it does give you a look at this character that I don't think anyone else has really reproduced. And I haven't read a whole lot of demon stuff. I know John Byrne did the Blood of the Demon series in the early 2000s, and he is a huge Jack Kirby fan. I think he has handled just about every character that Jack Kirby created. At one point or another, John Byrne has had a run on that character. He had a 4-issue OMAC miniseries that was actually very different than Jack Kirby's OMAC. But then I have not read any of his Blood of the Demon, but he might have tried to return to the roots of the character, whereas everyone else kind of handled the character a little differently. But I was very fascinated with how different this was than what I expected it to be, but by the end of the book, I still really enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun reading this, and if you guys like Jack Kirby's artwork and a lot of his crazy ideas, then you will probably like this book as well. So those are my thoughts on Jack Kirby's The Demon. I hope you guys liked this video, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I'll be back later with other videos this week. Have a great one.